If you ask a group of 5 electricians if you need to pre-twist your wires before installing wire nuts, you're gonna get 5 different answers. Today, I wanted to set my own biases aside and actually test this methodically. Do you need to pre-twist your wires? And we're gonna do so with this homemade contraption right here, the Wire Stretcher 3000! Hey, my name is Dustin. I'm a licensed master electrician. Welcome to this episode of Smarter Sparky. So what's the plan here? This contraption has a hydraulic cylinder on it, controlled by a hydraulic pump right here. As I push down on this, the hydraulic cylinder is going to pull this way. On this end, we've got a load cell. This load cell is actually going to monitor how much force is being pulled on this side of the contraption. And it's gonna read on this screen right here. Right here on this monitor, we're actually gonna be able to have a live graph of how much force is being pulled here. So the idea is we're gonna take our wire nut tests and we're gonna install them between these 2 points right here. There are holes inside of these blocks that are gonna allow us to thread our wire inside, and then we're gonna be able to clamp the wire in place. As the hydraulic cylinder is pulling, it is gonna pull on the wire nut, and we're gonna see how much force it takes to make that connection actually fail. For said testing, I've got 160 pieces of wire cut here. I've got 14 gauge and 12 gauge. Solid and stranded. We're gonna be testing 4 different concepts. No pre-twist at all, no pre-twist, but we're gonna twist until it twists outside of the wire nut. Pre-twisting, and we're gonna test pre-twisting plus allowing the wires to continue to twist after we have done it for another inch outside of the wire nut. And then we're gonna do these tests on both solid and stranded, and we're gonna test 2 14s, 3 14s, 2 12s, and 3 12s. So we're gonna be doing a total of 64 different tests here, and we're gonna hopefully get some real data on whether or not this is actually something that we need to worry about. For this video, we're gonna be using these 3M512 wire nuts. This video is not what is the best wire nut, it is what is the best connection method. So we're gonna be having one variable, and we're gonna be using these wire nuts. All right, test number 1 is solid 14 gauge wire, no pre-twist. 2 of them. So they get slid in both of these holes right here. And originally I was going to use some sort of weird clamping system in here. I found that just vice grips works so much better in this. I know it's going to obscure the screen here a little bit. Is what it is. It works so much better though. And clamp it down. All right, test 101. Here we go. All right, the cap broke, but the actual wire is still on the wire nut. So the connection is still made. It's just the cap came off, the plastic came off. And that is 112 pounds right there. And we are just stripping the insulation off of this now. That connection is still made. This thing is so tight right now. Remember, this is no pre-twist. And there is so much tension on this. It sounds like a guitar string. All right, let's keep going, see if we can break this. Yeah, oh, there it goes. And that broke the wire. That did not break the connection. The wire itself broke. So the connection in there is still made. That's crazy, I did not expect that. Look at that, it broke the actual wire. Remember, this is the no pre-twist. This is just put them in there right next to each other and twist the wire nut until it was snug. That was it. 113.4 pounds. Run 102. Here we go. Again, the plastic failed first at 80 pounds. Oh, there it broke. That time the actual connection broke. So that time the spring came off at 80.8 pounds. So right there is where the plastic broke. And right here is where the actual spring connection broke. And it looks like the wires actually slipped out of the spring at that point. For the first combination, 2 14 gauge solid wires with no pre-twist, the first run had a max force of 113.4 pounds and resulted in the wire breaking. The second run had a max force of 80.8 pounds, resulting in the wire pulling out. The average force was 97.1 pounds. All right, for the next test, we've got the 3 14 gauge wires not pre-twisted. So this is just 3 straight wires in. and put the wire nut on. No pre-twisting at all. £98, and it pulled out right from the connection. For the three 14-gauge solid wires with no pre-twist, the first run had a max force of 98.6 pounds with a pull-out failure mode. The second run maxed out at 102.4 pounds and resulted in wire break. The average force was 100.5 pounds. Two 12-gauge wires, no pre-twist. So that broke the, looks like we're just pulling insulation out now. Oh, there we broke, geez. 168 pounds, holy cannolis. So the first failure was, of course, the plastic. It stayed in the wire nut, and again, this time it was the actual wire that broke. The wire is still inside the spring. That is crazy. I was not expecting this. Both runs of two solid 12-gauge wires with no pre-twist resulted in wire breakage. First test had a max force of 168 pounds. First test had a max force of 168 pounds, and the second run had a max force of 155 pounds. The average force was 161.5 pounds. All right, test 107, three 12-gauge wires, no pre-twist. Plastic failed at 162, and then the wire sheared off on the spring. It pancaked the bottom couple twists of that spring within the connector. It actually folded them back over themselves. That is a lot of force. Three 12-gauge solid wires with no pre-twist also had a common failure of wire breakage. Both tests were very close at 168.8 and 171.8 pounds respectively. The average force was 170.3 pounds. I really want to see how the stranded wire compares to this. So let's set up and let's do the exact same test, no pre-twist with the stranded wire. All right, well, I guess this is our new camera angle since that GoPro decided it doesn't want to be a pro. Let's get back to it. All right, test number 501. Two stranded 14-gauge wires, no pre-twist. Here we go. That failed at 26 pounds. Maybe the argument's gonna be stranded versus solid now. Or maybe it is a pre-twist versus no pre-twist. Moving on to the stranded wires with no pre-twist, two 14-gauge wires had a common failure mode of pull-out. The first test had a max force of 26.4 pounds. The second test was our lowest value yet at 8.6 pounds. This is very much an outlier. The average force was 17.5 pounds. Run 503. Three stranded 14-gauge wires, no pre-twist. Wire nut failure at 28 pounds. And then the wires pull apart at about 10. Three 14-gauge wires with no pre-twist had a common failure mode of pullout. The measured maximum forces were 28.8 and 45.2 pounds. The average value was 37 pounds. 505, two stranded wires, no pre-twist. Here we go. Oh, there we go. Failure at 43.8 pounds. Two 12-gauge wires with no pre-twist had a common failure mode of pullout. 43.8 and 75.4 pounds were the maximum forces recorded, with an average value of 59.6 pounds. Run number 507, three stranded 12-gauge wires, no pre-twist. Interesting. We got up to 111 pounds, and it looks like it was a pull-out failure. Continuing the trend, three 12-gauge wires with no pre-twist also had a common failure mode of pull-out. The first run had a max force of 111 pounds, and the second run had a max force of 105. The average max force was 108 pounds. So all of the stranded, no pre-twist wires failed due to the wire pulling out of the wire nut. I am just dying to find out what happens if we pre-twist. So let's test all of the solid pre-twists, and then we'll test all of the stranded pre-twists. Two solid 14-gauge wires with a pre-twist. And notice the twists are coming out. Whoa, jeez. And I just bottomed out the hydraulic cylinder. How should we handle this? All right, there it broke at 112. And again, I guess that test is kind of unfair, but that was a conductor failure. not a wire nut failure. I mean, yeah, the cap came off, but the spring was still holding it. I'm really thinking the argument should be solid versus stranded wire instead of pre-twist versus not pre-twist. Now we're getting into the pre-twist data. The first test of two 14 gauge solid wires with a pre-twist had very close max forces of 112 and 125 pounds. Both resulted in wire break. The average max force was 118.5 pounds. So for the three 14 gauge wires that are pre-twisted, I'm gonna have to actually untwist this twisting outside of the wire nut. Again, it is still pre-twisted all up inside of the wire nut. So our test is still going to be twist versus no twist. But because all it does is it just untwists the outside anyway, the stroke of the cylinder isn't long enough to do all of that untwisting. So rather than having to just let the cylinder untwist that, inch that's outside of here, I'm just going to unbraid that. But again, up inside of that wire nut, it is still pre-twisted that entire way. Three 14 gauge wires, pre-twisted, run number 303. Oh my, 127, and it broke actually back where it was crimped on with the vice grip. Let's just keep going with it. Yeah, it broke again at the same point. Well, that time it actually just snapped the wire right in half, which it may have been fatigued from before. So in that case, it was actually the wire not even at the wire nut that failed. Three 14 gauge solid wires with a pre-twist provided 127.8 and 119 pounds of maximum force, and a common failure mode of wire breakage. The average max force was 123.6 pounds. Run number 305. This is two 12 gauge solid wires with a pre-twist. I notice that wire nut starts to spin a little bit. Jeez! That hit the ceiling really hard. Oh, what is this gonna do? That is untwisting that. It untwisted the wire nut. It actually untwisted the spring. Interesting. Oh wow, and these are warm. I mean, they're not hot, but they're warm. And look at how it flattened out the actual spring connector. This should be conical the entire way, and it flattened out the last two spins of that spring. And it really stretched out the top. There's a lot of force there. So this is 135.8. Two 12 gauge solid wires with pre-twist proved to be interesting. The first test we saw resulted in the actual spring unwinding and saw a max force of 135.8 pounds. The second test was a simple wire break at 165 pounds. The average max force was 150.4 pounns. Run 307. Three 12 gauge solid wires with a pre-twist. There goes the plastic at 167. Wire breakage at 172. Wrapping up the solid pre-twist with three 12 gauge solid wires, both tests resulted in wire breakage at 172.8 and 165.8 pounds. The average max force was 169.3 pounds. And finally, let's do the stranded pre-twisteds. Run 701. Two stranded 14 gauge wires with a pre-twist. And the wire nut came off at 40, and the wires came apart about 10. For our last set of tests, we start out with two 12 gauge stranded wires with a pre-twist. Both failed due to pullout with a max force of 40.2 and 35.8 pounds. The average max force was 38 pounds. 703, three 14 gauge wires stranded with a pre-twist. Hey, that one, the wire broke. Sheared off at the sharp edge of the vice grips. 74.4. Three 14 gauge stranded wires with a pre-twist had max forces at 74.4 and 84.4 pounds. The first test resulted in wire breakage, whereas the second was pullout. The average max force was 79.4 pounds. 705. Two 12 gauge stranded wires with a pre-twist. Plastic failure at 122. Two 12-gauge stranded wires with a pre-twist had a little bit of spread between the max forces, with the first being 122 pounds and the second at 79.2 pounds. Both failed due to pullout and had an average max force of 100.6 pounds. 707. Three 12-gauge wires stranded with a pre-twist. Plastic failure at 102 and pull out at roughly 80 something. And for our final test, three pre-twisted stranded 12-gauge wires both resulted in pullout and had a maximum force of 102 and 68.8 pounds. The average force being 85.4 pounds. So what about all these other wires that I prepared? All these is just permutations on pre-twist or no pre-twist. And basically what I did is I just kept twisting them afterwards. I see some people doing this out in the field and it drives me crazy, because then when you have to undo this connection, you've got so many twists. And I wanted to see, does this make it stronger? But in an earlier test, we actually saw that if we were to test this, all it's gonna do is untwist this connection, and I don't have enough travel on the cylinder to do that and pull the connection at the same time. For me to test that right now, it would be a redundant test, because basically I would just have to uncoil all this by hand, and then we're just testing a pre-twist versus a non-pre-twist again. We've already tested pre-twist and non-pre-twist, so there is no need to actually go through these other permutations. We can save those for another time, possibly another experiment. Originally, my plan was to actually do the testing like this, where the wire nut would actually be housed down inside like so, and then it would get clamped on this side. And that is actually why these wires were cut so long, is so we could do this test right here. But see, the issue with this test is all this really does is test how well they've actually put the spring inside of that connection. Now there we just saw 194 pounds of force, and that's what it actually took to pull out the spring from that actual connection. Notice the wires didn't come out at all. Now this video's gone on long enough, and I did want to do a run like this, but the problem is these are the only wire nuts that I found that can actually do this test reliably. In my initial pre-testing, I was using these red tans, which these are my favorite wire nut, and these things were failing at like 20 pounds. Versus this one we just saw was 194 pounds. So the wire nut itself is very dependent on what the pullout strength of the actual spring is. So that's why I did the tests that we did by pulling everything sideways instead of axially like we just did here. We could certainly go through and do those tests in the future like this. When I was doing my initial pre-tests, I also would put a washer behind here, so when the spring actually did pop out, then it would hit the washer, and then I would have to test the actual pullout strength of the spring, which would get up a little bit higher, but still, we are actually approaching the tensile strength of the wire itself. Now, because in this case, we've got two wires, that would double that tensile strength. So this would be an absolutely valid test in the future, and I do think we would see some different results. But I just wanted to address that real quick, because I know there's gonna be questions, why didn't we test it this way? That's the reason why. There's inconsistencies in the wire nuts. These, again, these are my favorite wire nuts. I've never had one of these wire nuts fail like that out in the field, but these things were like failing at like 20, 30, 40 pounds, somewhere in there. And we just saw these red ones just failed at almost 200 pounds. Now that I think about it, I think the pre-testing I was doing was only with these red tans and stranded wire. So, this is solid right here. So maybe that's why we saw these increased levels here. All right, let's take a look at the results. Here we've got the data for solid wire. In the blue, we've got no pre-twist, and in the orange, we've got pre-twist. Again, each test was done twice, so you're gonna see the combinations are doubled up on the bottom. And because each test is only done twice, there could be an argument that we might not have enough statistical significance in order to draw any conclusions. However, I believe just messing around in the workshop, I think this is a pretty good idea of what we might expect to see. I think this graph is pretty telling. I think this puts a nail in the coffin, at least for solid wire, that pre-twisting doesn't actually make a difference. For sure, there is some variation, and we can definitely see, at least in these three tests right here, that the pre-twist actually outperformed the non-pre-twist. We're talking about 100 pounds of force here. You should never have 100 pounds of force on on your wire. If you do have that much force on your wire, you've got other problems. And towards the end here, there's really no meaningful difference between the values that we measured. So this data to me is the nail in the coffin. Pretwisting doesn't matter on solid wire. Now, if we take a look at the stranded wire, the story's a little bit different. We can see very clearly that the pretwisting outperforms the non-pretwisting in almost every test except for these last two. If we take, for example, two 12-gauge wires stranded and we look at non-pretwist versus pretwist, the pretwist more than doubles the performance of the non-pretwist. I am very suspicious of this very low value right here, that 8.6 pounds we got on the two 14-gauge stranded with no pretwist. I would like to do more testing in the future to see if this is actually the case or if this was simply a failure of my testing procedures. Finally, both of these graphs are the averages of our solid and our stranded wires. So this is all the data averaged out from both runs for each combination. And again, we can see they are so close to each other after being averaged out that for solid wire, it really doesn't look like it matters. But we can see that clear difference over here on the stranded wire. There is a very clear advantage to doing pretwisting with stranded wire. Again, we've got a little bit of a reversal here on this very last test, but again, these values are so high, you should never be seeing those forces on your connection, period. So what's my takeaway from this? Solid wire, it doesn't matter if you pretwist or not. Stranded wire, it's kind of looking like it might be advantageous to pretwist. What do I actually do out in the field? It totally depends on the situation. Do I pretwist? Yeah, I pretwist frequently. Do I pretwist all the time? No, I don't. For solid wires, I don't typically bother with it unless there's quite a few wires in a particular wire nut. Typically the stranded wires I'll pretwist, but I've never pretwisted the wires thinking I'm pretwisting just for the sake of pretwisting. It's a lot easier to get the wire nut started. You're controlling those strands once you twist them around each other. Then the wire nut goes on a little bit better. Seeing this data though, it's looking like that is actually working out for another reason as well. It is a stronger connection for those stranded wires. And if you take a look at the instructions for any wire nut, you're gonna see right in the instructions, they say pretwisting is unnecessary. There are lots of other tests we could do as well. I would be really interested to see, does a pretwisted connection carry more current than a non-pretwisted connection? We could actually test what the strongest wire nut is, or we could actually test what the maximum holding force of a Wago is. If there are any nerds out there that would like to see how I built the wire stretcher, I've got a full build series available to Patreon members. Go check it out. If you made it this far, consider liking and subscribing. Drop a comment below on what you would like to see tested next. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.